His laughter at her scars echoed in the hangar. Private Jenkins thought she was just a quiet lieutenant, an easy target. He never expected a 4-star general to expose the legendary warrior hiding behind them in front of everyone. The air in Hangar 7 was a thick, industrial cocktail. It tasted of hot metal and vaporized hydraulic fluid, with the sharp, kerosene tang of jet fuel clinging to the back of your throat. Under the relentless hum of stadium-sized fluorescent lights, the polished concrete floor reflected the organized chaos of Ramstein Air Base. Technicians in blue fatigues moved with purpose around the sleek, gray bodies of fighter jets and cargo planes, their voices a low murmur beneath the distant scream of engines being tested on the flight line. Lieutenant Maya Reyes moved through this world like a ghost. Clipboard in hand, she navigated the maze of equipment with an economy of motion that felt strangely out of place. Her pace was steady, her focus absolute as she cross-referenced serial numbers against the morning's requisition forms. In the oppressive warmth of the hangar, her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing what some of the newer airmen had started calling the road map. It was a chaotic lattice of jagged scars that covered both of her forearms. Some were pale, thin lines, almost invisible against her skin. Others were a livid, puckered ridge of tissue, a permanent record of some violent history she never spoke of. From across the hangar, leaning against a diagnostic cart, Private First Class Jenkins watched her with a smug amusement. Fresh out of tech school with honors, he'd been at Ramstein for 3 weeks, long enough to feel like he owned the place. His uniform was still stiff, his confidence unmarred by the realities of deployment. "Check out Lieutenant Papercuts," Jenkins snickered to his small audience of equally green airmen. He gestured with his chin towards Reyes. "What kind of maintenance officer looks like they lost a fight with a barbed wire filing cabinet?" His friends chuckled on cue. The laughter was just loud enough to carry, but quiet enough to be deniable, a perfect little act of insubordination. They were learning the boundaries, or so they thought. As Reyes's route brought her toward their section, her gait remained unchanged, purposeful and direct. She didn't look at Jenkins or his friends, but a subtle tension in her shoulders suggested she'd heard every syllable. "Attention," barked Staff Sergeant Davis from a nearby workstation, his voice a gravelly whip crack that cut through the chatter. The group straightened up, their movements lazy and performative. It was the illusion of respect, not the substance of it. As Reyes passed, Jenkins couldn't resist pushing the envelope. Her quiet refusal to acknowledge his taunts felt like a challenge. "Careful with those maintenance reports, Lieutenant," he called out, his voice laced with mock concern. "Looks like you already lost one battle with some paperwork." A noticeable hush spread through the immediate area. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A wrench stopped turning. Eyes darted between the cocky private and the silent lieutenant. Reyes stopped. She turned slowly, her body moving as a single, fluid unit. Her expression wasn't angry, or hurt, or offended. It was something far more unsettling, quiet assessment. Her dark eyes met his, and for a long moment, the cavernous hangar seemed to shrink to the space between them. There was a depth in that gaze, an ancient stillness that made the skin on Jenkins's neck prickle. He felt like he was being weighed, measured, and filed away as unimportant. Without a word, she turned and continued her rounds. "Man, what's her deal?" Jenkins muttered, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. The strange power of that stare lingered on him like a physical touch. An older crew chief working on a nearby engine panel spoke without looking up. "You might want to dial it back, kid." "For what?" "She's just a maintenance officer," Jenkins scoffed, his voice a little too loud. "Probably got those falling down a flight of stairs." The crew chief just shook his head, his silence a verdict that Jenkins was too arrogant to comprehend. Later that morning, the daily briefing was held in the base command center. Jenkins sat near the back, slouched in his chair, trading whispered jokes with his friends. The room filled with the quiet authority of officers and senior NCOs, their attention focused on Colonel Harrington at the podium. The briefing droned on with the usual updates: operational readiness, maintenance schedules, security protocols. Jenkins's attention drifted until the topic shifted to a classified component failure on one of the new stealth drones. "The thermal signature is unavoidable with the current configuration," Colonel Harrington stated, pointing a laser at a complex technical diagram on the massive screen behind him. "We'll need to adjust mission parameters to account for this limitation." His tone was final. From the back of the room, a soft voice cleared its throat. "Sir, if I may." Every head turned. It was Lieutenant Reyes. She rarely, if ever, spoke in these briefings. "Go ahead, Lieutenant," Harrington said, a flicker of impatience in his voice. "The signature issue could be mitigated by reversing the intake manifold's orientation," Reyes suggested, her voice calm and steady. It was effective on the earlier X-7 prototype. "The schematics in the archives confirm the housing is compatible with the current model." A stunned silence fell over the room. Colonel Harrington stared at the diagram, then back at Reyes, his mind clearly racing through forgotten technical archives. He nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. I'd completely forgotten about that modification. Make it happen." Jenkins stared, his mouth slightly agape. Since when did a full-bird colonel, a base commander, defer to a lieutenant on highly classified stealth technology? And how did a maintenance officer, someone who managed spare parts and schedules, possess that level of detailed, esoteric knowledge? As the briefing concluded, Jenkins watched Reyes more closely. She packed her datapad, exchanged a few quiet words with a captain from intelligence, and headed for the door. An impulse he couldn't explain seized him. "Be right back," he muttered to his friend, and quickly followed her into the hallway. "Hey, Lieutenant," he called out, catching up to her. She turned, her expression as neutral as ever. Up close, he could see the scars more clearly. They weren't neat, accidental lines. They were deep, chaotic, the kind born from significant trauma. "Private," she acknowledged, her voice a low murmur. Jenkins, emboldened by his own confusion, couldn't let it go. "Look, about that drone stuff in there. I could show you how proper systems analysis is done sometime," he offered, a condescending smirk spreading across his face. "Might help you avoid future accidents." He made a slight, deliberate gesture toward her scarred arm. Reyes shifted away from his implied touch. It wasn't a flinch of fear, but a precise, fluid movement, an almost imperceptible microcorrection that spoke of years of honed spatial awareness. It was the movement of someone trained to anticipate and evade unseen threats. "I appreciate the offer, Private," she said, her voice perfectly level. "But I think I can manage." A veteran pilot passing by caught the end of the interaction. He gave Reyes a nod of profound respect that was bizarrely deferential. "Lieutenant," he said, his tone one a major might use when addressing a general, not someone 2 ranks below him. Jenkins's frown deepened. Nothing was adding up. The respect from senior personnel, the classified knowledge, the way she moved. Those scars told a story, and it was a story that flatly contradicted everything her rank and position suggested. "Just trying to help, ma'am," Jenkins said, recovering his smirk. "Seems like you could use some guidance on staying safe around the equipment." For a split second, something flickered deep in Reyes's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something older, colder. For that one instant, Jenkins felt like he was being assessed by a predator, measured and found wanting. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual placid mask. "Safety is important," she agreed mildly. "So is knowing the difference between a battle you need to fight, and one you should walk away from." She held his gaze for one final, unnerving moment before turning and continuing down the hallway. Jenkins watched her go, his certainty shaken. It hadn't been a threat. It had been advice. And somehow, that was infinitely more unsettling. "You're playing with fire, Jenkins," Staff Sergeant Davis's voice cut in from behind him. Jenkins turned to find the sergeant watching him with a hard, unreadable expression. "Sir. She's just a maintenance officer." Davis shook his head slowly, a look of pity on his face. "There are things you don't understand about this place yet, Private. People who aren't what they seem." 2 days later, the base command center was a hive of controlled panic. An unscheduled inspection by Yukon Brass, a 4-star general, no less, had sent a shockwave through the base leadership. Officers were shouting orders, enlisted personnel were scrambling to update displays, and the entire space buzzed with a frantic, high-stakes energy. Jenkins and his crew had been pulled from their regular duties to help with the preparations. It was menial work, arranging chairs, cleaning projection screens, stacking briefing folders. "This is garbage duty," he grumbled, slamming a stack of folders onto the massive conference table. "I didn't go through advanced technical training to play janitor for a bunch of brass." "Just shut up and work, Jenkins," one of his peers muttered. "The sooner we finish, the sooner we're out of here." Jenkins ignored him, his complaints growing louder as Lieutenant Reyes entered the command center. She moved to her station at the maintenance coordination terminal, her movements as calm and methodical as ever, a small island of tranquility in the sea of chaos. Seeing her ignited Jenkins's frustration. He felt a need to reassert himself, to regain the attention of his dwindling audience. "Look who it is," he said, loud enough for his friends to hear. Lieutenant Scarface, back for another thrilling day of pushing papers. A few of his friends snickered, but the sound was weak, subdued. His jokes were wearing thin. Jenkins felt the need to push harder. "Hey, Lieutenant," he called across the room. "Did you hear about the inspection today? Better make sure your paperwork is in order. Wouldn't want any more accidents." Reyes didn't even twitch. She continued her system checks as if he were nothing more than a malfunctioning light fixture. Her complete and utter indifference was more infuriating than any retort. It was a silent declaration that he didn't matter. He opened his mouth to deliver another, sharper barb, a truly nasty one this time, when the main doors to the command center swung open with force. "Attention on deck," a voice roared. The entire room snapped to attention as if struck by lightning. In walked General Maxwell Thornton, the 4-star commander of U.S. European Command. He was flanked by a steely-eyed entourage of colonels and aides. His chest was a billboard of military history, rows of ribbons and medals telling stories of conflicts and commendations spanning decades. He was a living legend, a man whose presence seemed to suck the very air out of the room. Jenkins stood ramrod straight, his heart hammering against his ribs, his earlier arrogance instantly evaporated and replaced by primal fear. "Welcome to Ramstein, General," Colonel Harrington said, stepping forward. "We're honored by your visit." "At ease," the general replied, his voice a low baritone that carried effortless authority. "This isn't a formal inspection, Colonel. I was in the area for the NATO conference and thought I'd drop by to see how our finest European base is functioning." The room relaxed by a collective, invisible millimeter. The general began his walk through, nodding at senior officers, occasionally pausing to ask a sharp, insightful question about operations. It was all routine, all by the book. Lieutenant Reyes stood quietly at her station, at attention like everyone else, her face a professional, unreadable mask. The general continued his circuit, his eyes scanning every detail. Then, he stopped. He stopped so abruptly that the aide behind him almost collided with him. His gaze was fixed. His eyes, which had been scanning the room with detached authority, now widened with dawning, utter disbelief. They were locked onto the quiet maintenance lieutenant standing by the far wall. The already quiet command center fell into an eerie, absolute silence, broken only by the soft hum of server fans. Senior officers exchanged bewildered glances. Eyebrows shot up. What could possibly make a 4-star general freeze like that? "My God," General Thornton said, his powerful voice suddenly a hushed whisper that seemed to echo in the stillness. "Phantom? Is that really you?" The name hung in the air like smoke. Phantom. Jenkins watched in utter confusion as a shockwave of recognition rippled through the room's senior ranks. Every officer over the age of 40, every master sergeant with more than 2 decades of service, somehow stood even straighter. Their attention was now a laser beam, split between the general and the quiet maintenance officer Jenkins had been tormenting for weeks. A colonel near the front whispered to his aide, his voice trembling with awe. "The Phantom, from Operation Blackstone." Something was happening that Jenkins didn't understand, a current of shared history and profound respect flowing through the room that completely excluded him and the other new arrivals. "It's good to see you, sir," Reyes replied, her voice steady, but her eyes, for the first time, revealed a flicker of something complex and unreadable. Then it happened. It was something so fundamentally contrary to the laws of military physics that Jenkins would later describe it as the most shocking thing he'd ever witnessed. General Maxwell Thornton, a man who commanded thousands of troops, who advised presidents, who held the fate of nations in his hands, snapped to attention. Before Lieutenant Reyes could even begin to raise her hand to salute him, the general rendered a crisp, perfect salute to her. "You didn't salute down. Ever." It was a rule as immutable as gravity. Jenkins felt his jaw physically drop. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. "Colonel Reyes," General Thornton said warmly, his voice filled with a respect so deep it was almost reverence. "It's been too long. Colonel." The word hit Jenkins like a physical blow. Fragments of hushed stories from basic training, tales of legendary operators told in hushed tones, came rushing back. The Phantom of North Africa. The impossible rescue mission that saved a diplomatic delegation. The operator whose tactical genius was so revered they were known only by a call sign for operational security. "Sir," was all Reyes, apparently, Colonel Reyes, said quietly. She glanced around the room, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces, the confusion, the dawning, thunderstruck recognition. Of course," the general nodded, lowering his salute only after she had returned it. He smiled. "But surely they could have given you a more appropriate assignment than maintenance logistics?" "I requested this assignment, sir," she said, her voice firm, carrying a quiet authority that suggested the topic was not open for discussion, even with him. "I prefer it." The general's smile became knowing. "Still avoiding the spotlight. Some things never change." He turned to address the stunned room. "For those of you who don't know, you have been working alongside one of the finest tactical minds in our military. Colonel Reyes led operations that most of you have only heard as whispers, the kind that change history without ever making it into the history books." Jenkins felt physically ill. The room started to spin. Every joke, every smirk, every condescending comment he'd ever made played back in his mind in horrifying, vivid clarity. He hadn't just been mocking an officer. He had been mocking a living legend. Colonel Reyes, the general continued, his voice resonating with pride, was the architect behind Operation Blackstone. For some of you senior officers, that name needs no explanation. For the rest of you, let's just say that when our country needed someone to do the impossible, they sent the Phantom. Throughout this earth-shattering revelation, Reyes maintained her composure, but Jenkins could see a new tension in her posture. She looked deeply, profoundly uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir," she interjected, her voice respectful but firm. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in private?" "Always the professional," the general chuckled. "Very well. Colonel Harrington, might we use your office?" "Of course, General," Harrington replied, his voice now laced with a new kind of deference, directed not just at the general, but at Reyes too. As Reyes walked past him toward the office, Jenkins couldn't meet her eyes. A fire of pure, unadulterated shame burned through him, incinerating the flimsy, cocky exterior he had so carefully constructed. He was nothing. He was less than nothing. When the office door closed behind the general, Colonel Harrington, and Colonel Reyes, the command center erupted. Whispers flew like shrapnel. Senior NCOs were quietly explaining to wide-eyed junior enlisted exactly who Phantom was. Officers huddled in small, stunned groups, trying to process the implications of having such a figure working anonymously on their base. "I told you to ease up," the old crew chief from the hangar said, suddenly appearing at Jenkins's side. His voice was low and devoid of any "I told you so" satisfaction. "Some people aren't what they seem." "I didn't know," Jenkins managed to choke out, his own voice barely a whisper. "That was the point," the crew chief replied grimly. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you do know?" Jenkins had no answer. He stood frozen, replaying weeks of his own idiocy in his mind, each incident now viewed through a new, horrifying lens of understanding. The quiet competence, the deference from senior NCOs, the scars that spoke of battles he couldn't even begin to imagine. 20 minutes later, the office door opened. General Thornton emerged first, followed by Colonel Harrington and Reyes. Their expressions gave nothing away, but the energy in the room had changed. "Continue with your duties," the general announced. "Colonel Reyes will remain in her current position, as is her preference. I expect each and every one of you to maintain absolute operational security regarding her identity and background. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, she is Lieutenant Reyes, maintenance officer. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," filled the room. The general nodded, satisfied. As he and Reyes walked toward the exit, he paused near Jenkins. He fixed the young private with a penetrating stare that seemed to see every foolish, arrogant thought he'd ever had. "What's your name, son?" Jenkins snapped to attention so hard his teeth clicked. "Private First Class Jenkins, sir." The general studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Reyes. An unspoken communication passed between them, a message Jenkins couldn't begin to decipher. "Carry on, Private," the general finally said, before turning and leaving the command center. Jenkins remained at attention until they were gone, then slumped against the nearest wall, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for half an hour. Staff Sergeant Davis approached, his expression stern but not unkind. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jenkins." "Yes, Sergeant," Jenkins replied automatically. "Those scars," Jenkins said quietly, his voice hollow. "They're not from paperwork accidents." Davis gave him a look that said, "You think?" "No, Private. They're not. They're from pulling her platoon sergeant out of a burning vehicle under enemy fire in Kandahar. They're from shielding a young Marine from the shrapnel of an IED. They're from a dozen operations that people like you and me will never, ever know about. She chose to be here, in this hangar, because the one thing she couldn't outrun was her own legend. She just wanted to fix things for a while." The weight of his own ignorance felt like it was crushing him. He found Colonel Reyes alone in an equipment room later that day, reviewing maintenance logs. When she looked up and saw him frozen in the doorway, her expression was calm. "Private Jenkins," she acknowledged. His heart pounded. "Ma'am. Colonel. I need to apologize," he began, his voice cracking. "The things I said. About your scars. About everything. I was arrogant. I was disrespectful. I had no idea." "At ease, Private," she interrupted, her voice gentle. "You weren't meant to know. But I was insubordinate. I was a fool." "Yes," she agreed simply, without a trace of anger. "You were." Her straightforward acknowledgement left him no defense, no corner to hide in. It was a simple statement of fact. "I don't know what to say," Jenkins admitted, his shame complete. She rolled down her sleeves, covering the jagged marks. "Scars tell stories, Private. Not all of them are meant for public consumption. Judge less. Observe more. That's all." She gathered her materials and walked past him. At the door, she paused. "Everyone makes mistakes, Jenkins. The measure of a soldier isn't in avoiding them. It's in how they respond once they realize they've made one. And then she was gone. In the weeks that followed, Private Jenkins changed. The cocky smirk was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. He arrived early, stayed late, and completed every task with a focus that bordered on obsession. His friends, confused by the disappearance of their former ringleader, tried to draw him out, but he deflected their questions with vague responses. He no longer had time for jokes. He had work to do. The base had settled into a strange new normal. Colonel Reyes, still wearing her lieutenant's insignia, continued to oversee the maintenance division with the same quiet efficiency. But now, people saw her differently. There was a reverence in their interactions, an attentiveness when she spoke. Generals on inspection tours would happen to swing by her section, just to offer a quiet, respectful nod. Jenkins learned. He watched her train new technicians on the intricacies of an F-35's diagnostic systems, her guidance always patient, her expertise bottomless. She told no war stories. She never leveraged her legendary status. There was only the quiet competence, and an occasional, wry smile when a young airman finally got something right. One afternoon, Jenkins was working late, troubleshooting a stubborn diagnostic panel, when Reyes entered the maintenance bay, apparently to finish some work of her own. For nearly an hour, they worked in companionable silence at opposite ends of the hangar. Finally, Jenkins solved his problem, letting out a small sigh of satisfaction as the system blinked online. "Good work," Reyes said from across the space. "Those panels can be tricky." "Thank you, ma'am," Jenkins replied. He hesitated, then took a chance. "Ma'am, was it as bad as they say? Operation Blackstone?" Reyes was silent for a long moment, and Jenkins feared he had overstepped. Then she sighed softly. "The thing about impossible situations, Jenkins, is that they're only impossible until someone does them. Then they just become difficult. And difficult is something any well-trained soldier can handle." It wasn't really an answer, but Jenkins understood it was all he would ever get. "I used to think the most impressive soldiers were the ones with the most combat ribbons," Jenkins admitted quietly. "The ones with all the stories." "And now?" Reyes asked. Jenkins looked at her directly, at this quiet officer who chose to serve in the shadows rather than stand in the spotlight she had more than earned. "Now," he said, "I think the most impressive ones are the ones who do what needs to be done, without needing anyone to know they did it." A ghost of a smile touched Reyes's lips. "You're learning, Private." The next morning, a new batch of recruits arrived at Ramstein. As Lieutenant Reyes walked past, Jenkins saw one of them, a kid with the same arrogant smirk he himself had once worn, eye her scars and lean in to whisper a joke to his friend. Jenkins walked over to them, his shadow falling over the recruits. "I'd be careful there," he said, his voice low and steady. "What, her?" the recruit scoffed. "She's just a maintenance officer." Jenkins looked from the clueless kid to the back of Colonel Reyes as she disappeared around the corner. He thought of generals who saluted lieutenants, and of legends who chose to serve in the dark. He thought of the scars she wore, not as marks of trauma, but as unspoken medals. "Trust me," Jenkins said, turning back to his work. "There's no such thing as just anything in this Air Force." He carried with him the lesson she had taught him without ever meaning to, that true valor is quiet, and the deepest respect is earned not by the rank on your collar, but by the weight of the burdens you carry in silence.